And we are live. So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time and or place you happen to be viewing from. This is the January 2019 ENSO seminar. The ENSO seminar will be delivered by Sanneke de Haan of Tilburg University, who will be speaking on an enactive approach to psychiatry. So I'm delighted that Sanneke is joining us in sort of one of the sort of central figures in the development of enactive thought and over for a fair bit of time now, starting off in the University of Heidelberg with Thomas Fuchs, and Sanneke has conducted research there in Heidelberg at the Department of Psychiatry and Academic Medical Center of the University of Amsterdam, and was also a postdoc in the Berlin School of Mind and Brain associated with Embodied University as well, before moving to a postdoc and now a full faculty position at Tilburg University, where she is continuing to develop the enactive approach to psychiatry that you've been working on for quite some time at this point. It's getting sort of well developed. Yeah. So I'll just give people sort of take a slow lead in, as it were. We are expecting one or two other participants to join the live session, and we'll give them a few moments to come online, and then we'll kick off with Sanneke's seminar and presentation. So what have we got? We have a few viewers already signed up and signed in. I think the others, as they join, they'll be polite and quiet as they join Sanneke. So they'll be muted, so they won't be. So yeah, we're running up at about 5 past the hour here. So I think and we've a few people come on stream. So I think I'll invite you, Sanneke, to begin the presentation, an enactive approach to psychiatry for the January 2019 ENSO seminar.
Okay.
Okay.
Shall I now share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. There we go.
Perfect.
And hide this. So it should be set now.
Excellent.
Hello and welcome everybody, and thanks very much for the invitation, Marek, and for your kind introduction. Yes, so it feels a bit strange to just talk to my own computer, but Marek told me you get used to it, so there we go. I'm going to talk today about an enactive approach to psychiatry, and the outline of my talk is as follows. I'll first explain what I mean by the integration problem, or what I think the integration problem in psychiatry is. I'll then introduce an enactive alternative to the existent models in psychiatry, and specifically I'll look at 3 implications of this enactive perspective on psychiatry regarding the integration of the dimensions, psychiatric disorders as disorders of sense-making, and implications for understanding causality involved. And then I should conclude. I know that in my abstract I actually promised to say something about the implications for treatment as well, but I found that I had already difficulty in keeping within the time limits as it was, so I skipped that part. But you're very welcome to ask questions afterwards on this. Oh yes, and if you hear some meowing, that's my cat, who is a bit. Yeah, you don't see her. Right. The integration problem in psychiatry. In 2009, psychiatrist Rachel Dew wrote an article with the title, "Why Psychiatry is the Hardest Specialty?" And she writes, "Being a psychiatrist means dealing with ambiguity all the time. I go to work and listen to someone describe a vague uneasiness felt for a lifetime. Then, after about 45 minutes, I'm asked to assign it a name." She says, "Sometimes I think she needs her serotonin levels tweaked. That's why she feels this way. The truth is, I don't really know why she feels this way. If I ask the right questions, I'd probably find something that happened in her childhood that could be considered traumatic. If not, I could probably find something in her current life that is a stressor. I could develop a sense that this problem is more psychological than biological. And she goes on to discuss several causes that could be considered in psychiatric disorders, ranging from indeed traumas to neurotransmitter problems. And then she says, but the hardest thing of all, harder still, is to imagine all of these causes happening together, responding to each other, making each other worse, compensating for each other, benefiting the person, harming the person, comforting the person, killing the person. I think this is basically what she describes here is what I would call the integration problem. So how to relate these very diverse and heterogeneous factors that range from genetic, neuronal, social to existential, etc., that may all play a role in the development and persistence of psychiatric disorders, how to relate them. And as Jill notes, it's not irrelevant how what we see as the cause, because what we see as the cause will likely determine the kind of treatment we will prescribe. And she says, regarding to this problem, she says, I need to have some sort of model for what I'm doing. Now, I think the first thing when it comes to models is that you would want to think about, okay, if we want a model for psychiatry, what should be in it? What is it that we want to relate? What is it that we want to integrate? And I would say here that there are 4 main dimensions that need to be integrated or related to each other. There are patients' experiences. There is the physiological dimension, which encompasses all of these genetic to neuronal factors. There's social-cultural influences, and there's what I call the existential dimension. Now, the first 3 are basically what is commonly known as the biopsychosocial model. So these are commonly recognized as main dimensions. The last one, what I mean by the existential dimension, is the fact that people relate to what happens to them. So it's not just their experiences, but also their own relation to their experiences, their relation to the world, their relation to their problems. And this is, I think, specifically important in psychiatry because it constitutes a certain loop that may be very maybe even constitutive for the problems at hand. So for instance, think of anxiety disorder or panic disorder, that it's one thing to have a panic attack, but to actually have a panic disorder is to be so frightened of having another panic attack that fright or that fear of a panic attack is actually the most disabling factor. It's in the whole process. Right, so this is what I mean with the existential dimension. Now, there are many models around of psychiatric disorders. And this is, I'm just going to be rushing a bit because I just don't want to spend too much time on evaluating all the existing models. Lots can be said about it, but I just want to say there's groups of models. On the one hand, we have one-sided models that are models that basically focus on one of these dimensions only. Then there are reductionist models that basically say that one of the dimensions is central, and that all the others depend on that or follow from that dimension, and the most common one being the neurobiological approach. There's dualist models like values-based psychiatry, saying that we should both take into account the patient's life, world, and values on the one hand, but also the standard medical look on things. And then there are some models that actually are meant to be or aim to be integrative. Like I just said, the biopsychosocial model has been developed by Engel in the 1970s already. And then there's the recent network model. I think there's problems with all of them. The first three, I think there's problems with all of them. And I'm happy to talk about this more during question time, because otherwise, if I just find I spend too much time on talking about these things. So yes, let me just say that the integrative models either do not really show how the dimensions relate, as in the biopsychosocial model, or in the network model, they claim to have an integrative model, but it's actually an empty mathematical model that doesn't actually, it presupposes an integrative theory rather than offering one, I think. Right, so what about the enactive alternative? I think the first, why would an enactive alternative do any better than the existing models? Well, I think an important reason is that if you take a step back, so to say, and look at the existing models, you see that many of them implicitly adopt a certain view of what the mind is, what the mental is, and how the mind relates to body and world, in a way that I would call a sort of a thinking that I would call internalist model of the mind. But there's different terms you can give to it, and I think a very helpful depiction is what Susan Hurley called the sandwich model of the mind. So we have the input, that's the perception. We have the juicy bit of cognitive processing that happens in between, and we have the output, the action. And if you look at the mind in such a way, then what psychiatric disorders appear as problems with this inner cognitive processing, with this patient's modeling of the world. It's not that something's wrong with their eyes or their ears. It's not that there's something wrong with their limbs and that they cannot actually act. So it has to be something going wrong with the processing in between. So that would be the idea following this picture. So what you get is a few of mental disorders where that's very individualist, internalist, and typically also brain focused. On the contrary, enactivism offers a very different conception of the mind and its relation to the body and the world. In their recent book, Retrieving Reality, Taylor and Dreyfus actually have this nice term of a mind-world topology. So how do we carve out, so to say, the relation between mind and world, and I would say mind, world, and body. And enactivism offers a very different view on that. And I think, and here too, I'm going to be a bit quick because I'll just focus on one that I think actually is in this context key notion, namely the notion of sensemaking. That sensemaking, that from an enactive perspective, cognition is understood as sensemaking, and sensemaking is the evaluative interaction of an organism with its environment. And to just get a bit of a feel for how different this way of understanding cognition and the mind is, I'll just elaborate a bit on this idea of sense-making, what it is. For many of you, this will already be very clear, but I'll just so we're all on the same page. So some characteristics of sense-making. First of all, sense-making is essential to living. And this is the gist of the so-called life-mind continuity thesis. The idea is that for any organism, in order to stay alive, it must distinguish within its environment what is food from what's poisonous. It must distinguish what's dangerous from what's safe. And this distinguishing, however basic that may be, is a form of sense-making. Yeah, so this can be indeed, it's important to stress that this can be really basic. And it's also the distinguishing doesn't mean that the bacteria is thinking, oh, that is sugar, that is food. But it does show that, or we can see how in its behavior, bacteria make these sort of, or how do you say, distinguish these things, or deter, or yeah, manage to sort of distinguish between elements in their environment. And this very basic thing is already making sense of their environment. And if they weren't able to do that, they would just die, basically. Connected to that is that sense making is necessarily embodied, and both embodied and embedded. It's bodily makeup that determines what the organism needs in order to be able to remain alive. What it has to make, and it is necessarily dependent on its environment, because it's, as an autonomous system, it needs these interaction with the environment in order to remain alive. And sense making implies values, or you could say metabolic values, to distinguish them from the values we'll talk about later on. And this is just to say that for the organism, the environment is not a neutral space, but the environment consists of things that are attractive to it and things that are not attractive to it or dangerous to it. And as I am telling this, my cat is actually chasing a pretty big spider and thinking about what to do with it. So that's a nice example of this going on right under my table. Right. And sense making is affective. So where the ordinary or the normal conception of cognition is sometimes opposed to, you have cognition, you have emotion. From this enactive perspective, sense making is through and through an affective, how do you say, interaction or experience. And I think one way to just say it is that affects are the sort of felt counterpart of the values that the environment has for the organism. So if something's dangerous, I'm frightened of it. And the dangerousness, so to say, of the thing in the environment and my feeling of fear are directly related. And as Colin Betty, who has written most about this, says, sense making is first and foremost a bodily affective evaluation. Finally, and this is somewhat of a new point, I think, and I think that it's an important one, especially in the context of psychiatry, and we talk about human beings, is that sense making can be reflexive. Sense making can relate to itself, what I would call existential sense making. So where we have the organism who is directly relating to its environment that has certain values to it. For us human beings, for us persons, there is an extra dimension that we relate to ourselves and that we relate to our interactions with the world, that we relate to others. And this makes a huge difference. So that's why I call it, that's also what it's typically, the distinction that's made also in philosophical anthropology of organism, environment, and person world. We can talk about whether, we'll come to that. So just to make this a little bit more tangible, you could say that this picture nicely sort of sketches the difference between the sense making, sort of basic sense making on the one hand, and existential sense making on the other. The picture actually is called "Why Your Dog is Happier Than You." So I'm not suggesting that this is a route to happiness, the existential dimension. But so the thing is that once you relate to what happens to you, a whole new way of being in the world, you could say, opens up. So we don't just care for food because it keeps us alive, or clothes because it keeps us warm. They have extra meaning for us in our social cultural communities. And this, on the one hand, this opens up a whole space of freedom. So we can, for instance, refrain from eating and for religious purposes or for dieting or so on. It opens up as a space of freedom, but it also gives us a need for meaning that goes beyond staying alive. So we just don't just want to stay alive, but we also want to live a meaningful life, or a good life. So that would mean that we have basic sense making in any living beings. And for some living beings, there is what you could say existential sense making or existentialized sense making. So to just spell this out, basic sense making is the direct, immersive, non-reflexive sense making that all living beings do. Explicit existential sense making would be reflecting on something. So I'm thinking about, I received a diagnosis from my doctor, and now I'm considering what this means to me to be diagnosed with depression or schizophrenia, for instance, a sort of explicit reflection. But the existential sense making goes further than that, and I would say once you are able to take this reflective position, then your whole sense making becomes what I just called, just for lack of a better word, existentialized sense making. So even your basic sense making is infused, so to say, with a meaning that goes beyond this basic sense making. Like I said, with the food or the clothes, I cannot escape from expressing something through what I wear, even if I'm just expressing that I don't care about clothes. But I can't refrain from being meaningful. This being meaningful, so to say. So one last point about this. Yeah, so I've been talking about persons and world and organism and environment. Does that mean that I think that existential sense making is only for humans? I think that's basically an empirical question. So I wouldn't say a priori that only human beings can do that. But in this context, I am interested in human beings and human persons specifically, and the kind of problems they have in sense making. So yeah, I think that's an empirical question. And is it a gradual or a qualitative thing? Well, I think it's kind of both. So I don't want to say this is a capacity that emerges from one day to the next full-fledged or something. That's just not, I mean, it is a gradual thing. And if you think of how children grow up and how children develop, I think you can see that it's a sort of set of capacities of learning to engage with or learning to see things from other people's perspective, so to say, and this being gradually more and more enlarged. However, I do think there is a qualitative shift that once you have obtained this existential stance, you can't go back. You can't not know anymore, so to say. So so then there is a qualitative shift in the system. Right. I feel like I've been talking about this way too long. Time to go to the enactive psychiatry. So psychiatric disorders refer to structurally disordered patterns of sense making, is what I would say. What I mean by that is that it's not that the sense making is somehow inappropriate or biased in a certain direction. So I see the world as too frightening, I'm too paranoid. I see too much meaning in the things that happen around me, or I see too little meaning in the things that happen around me. And the thing is that rather than adjust to the situation at hand, there is a sort of bias in my own sense making that I take wherever I go. So even when I'm doing something that I would normally consider fun, when I'm depressed, it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't. So it's not adjusted to the situation. I'm typically frightened or typically paranoid or typically depressed. And what's important that this notion of sense-making calls for a different unit of analysis of thinking about psychiatric disorder. So rather than this individual, internalist, brain-focused idea of what goes wrong in psychiatric disorders, the unit of analysis when it comes to sense-making is the person in interaction with the world. So it's a zooming out, not just in space. So we look at the whole person, the bodily being, in her context, but also in temporal sense. So because it's about interactions, you want to look at the developmental perspective. So it's structurally disordered patterns. So how have these patterns become ingrained or enacted in time and time again? Yes, so that's the sort of different overall picture you get. Now, hurrying on to the integration bit, the one that I promised that the enactive approach would have a good or a different and I think better perspective on. And indeed, I do think this. I think that from an enactive ontology, none of these 4 dimensions that I've talked about can be understood in isolation from the other 3. This is quite, I think, a radical position, but very much within the relational ontology that characterizes enactivism, I think, in the sense that we couldn't have experiences if we were not embodied and embedded beings. But it's not just that way around, because our physiology too is not something that exists anyway. Our physiology too, our physiological processes too, are an emergent characteristic of this larger system of organism, environment, or person interacting with their world. And the existential dimension is, at least for some beings, then added to that, changing everything, again, changing the whole system. Yes, so I would say that these 4 dimensions co-constitute the one-person world system. So you can't see any of them in isolation from the others. So I've been writing a book about enactive psychiatry. That's I should hand in a couple of the manuscript. I should hand it in a couple of months. Should have handed in last year already, but anyway. And so what I do there is I describe this integration of the dimensions in part 1 of the book, and then talk about the implications of this view in the second part. And that means basically addressing both the body-mind problem, but also integrating values into a naturalist approach of enactivism, and of course the social-cultural co-constitution of these dimensions. And in order to make this idea of how these dimensions relate more tangible, I want in this further, the final bit of this talk, I want to focus on this part, so the experience related to the physiology. And for that, I want to look at a specific example. So suppose someone who's depressed can have their mood improved either by taking antidepressants or going into psychotherapy. So how to understand what's happening in these 2 different cases, how to understand the interaction between brain processes on the one hand and patient experiences on the other. It may seem intuitive to think, okay, drugs somehow go from our brain to our experiences, and maybe psychotherapy is the other way around. Still being unclear how that would actually work. But from this enactive perspective on both of these, the experiential and the physiological, as being part of this larger system, this whole way of thinking is confused. So there can be no one-to-one causality, because we're basically looking at one system and different dimensions of this one system. of a person interacting with her world in this crudely depicted schema, which is more likely to be much more complicated, with lots of processes going on and that influence each other. And if you look at such a much more complex picture, it seems weird or even impossible how to carve out what's psychological here versus what's physiological here, to sort of draw a line. And it would even seem a bit ridiculous to just divide this whole complex system in these two molds, so to say. So from this enactive perspective, you already think of what's happening in these two cases differently. So if you look at the effects of drugs, you're not just looking at the effects of drugs, you're looking at the effect of taking drugs, and that's always in the larger context of a treatment relationship, of expectations, prior experiences, interaction with the rest of the body, with your previous history of taking medication. And many of these effects are summarized, are seen as placebo effects. But from an enactive perspective, this is sort of a strange thing to say. They're all effects, and they basically point, what we call placebo effects, basically point to the contextual factors that are not just contextual, but actually co-constitute what's happening. And similarly, the effects of psychotherapy are on the whole person. And being a bodily being, it directly affects my bodily or my body as well, in the sense that if I calm down, this is not just a psychological state, but being more calm rather than anxious means being less stressed, having less muscle tension, and having a different posture, and so on. Still, something that's important to say, there are, of course, differences. There are differences between these two cases. Depending on where you intervene in this complex system, you will have a different causal trajectory. So it's not to say that if it all hangs together, if everything is important, so to say, or everything plays a role. No, there's still differences, and there are important differences. So how to do justice to these differences? So I think what's been helpful for me is to think about the causality that's involved in a complex dynamical system such as ourselves, in terms of a cake rather than in a domino style. So let me explain this. So in terms of what I first started out with, if we think of taking drugs as influencing the brain, which then following that influences our psychological state, you get this. And if your picture of that is that of a linear causality, you have this mind-boggling idea that how can it be that we have a physiological domino stone that somehow hits a psychological domino stone? How does this work? This is sort of like this big mystery. But I suggest we should get rid of this whole linear picture of causality involved, and of thinking that there are only two things that affect each other. And I would suggest we think rather in terms of organizational causality, the causality involved in baking a cake. So if we want to bake a cake, we have many ingredients that moreover work on each other. So the sugar will, for instance, affect the gluten in the flour. Or if I knead the dough, the longer I knead it, it will get a different texture, and therefore the cake as a whole will taste differently. What I think, this is, by the way, this is all knowledge that I've gotten completely in a passive way by watching the Great British Bake Off series. So I'm not pretending to be having much first-hand knowledge of this, but it is it's a fascinating chemistry that's going on in baking a cake. And what I think is so interesting about baking a cake is that you can see how the things work on each other, and also that it makes insightful the idea of things like tipping points. So, for instance, if I would add one more grain of sugar, that would not affect the taste of the cake as a whole. But if I would double the amount of sugar, it certainly would be a sweeter cake. The same with eggs, for instance. I cannot just keep on adding eggs. At some point, it won't be a cake anymore, but rather a very sweet omelette or something. So if we then go back to the two different scenarios, we could say that pill taking is a kind of local to global causality that could be understood in terms of a local element, say the amount of sugar, affecting the cake as a whole. We have certain thresholds, but they might not be so clear cut. But in the end, by adding extra sugar, the taste as a whole, the taste of the cake as a whole will be different. The trick is just not to think in terms of this domino causality, but rather in terms of like the sugar is part of the cake. And therapy, on the other hand, we could say that is a kind of global to local causality. So that would be like the effect of the temperature of the oven on the texture of the cake. So if I, with a higher temperature, I have to make sure that I don't burn the outside of the cake while the inside is still doughy. Or I can leave it in too long and it will get dry. The cake as a whole will get dry. And here too, there are certain thresholds and there are certain differences. So the local will not, so the global effect of the temperature will affect some of its part more than others. But again, the trick is here not to think in terms of domino causality, but rather organizational causality. So what we can see that there is interaction, but it's not as if there's only two dimensions, the body for working on the mind or vice versa, but it's rather that they are both part of a larger system, and the causality involved is organizational. But it does matter where you intervene and how you intervene on the system. So the local to global is different from the global to local, and different local interventions, say adding more eggs or adding more sugar, will have different effects on the cake as a whole or the system as a whole. Yes, so this would be saying we can roughly distinguish local to more global, global to more local, but this is again just, of course, a rough distinction. Just this is just I'm running out of time, so I can't really describe this, but I just want to point out that the kind of causality involved, the relation involved here is best understood in terms of emergence. And I particularly like the conception of emergence as fusion that Humphreys introduced. Interestingly enough, there's been some recent work within enactivism or enactivist-minded, I'm not sure if they would all agree if I call them that, but minded theorists, so as like Michael Kirchhoff and Beate Krickel and Sean Gallagher, who talk about dynamic constitutive causality, which is, I think, very like the kind of cake-like example that I described. So, to come to my conclusion, I hope to have made somewhat probable that an enactive framework can help to get a different view on how the dimensions in psychiatric disorders relate, and that it can actually solve the integration problem by offering an integrative ontology from the very start, with sensemaking as one of its key notions. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanneke. Excellent.
So I should now skip. I should stop. Yeah, here.
I have to. Stop. Yeah, we switch back to. There we go.
Sharing screen, and then.
You're back.
Yes. Ah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that.
Hello.
Hi. So we have a couple of other live participants, Leonardo and Mark. If you'd like to join in the discussion, you can unmute your microphones now, and we can get stuck into some questions. So while we maybe Mark and Leonardo consider some wording. Sanneke, thank you very much for that. That was that's very rich. I love the baking analogy. I use that one myself with my students too, and it's a very there are few domains of human experience that are naturally where we kind of really appreciate that multi-causality, but I think baking really seems to bring it home. That was a delicious looking cake too.
Yes.
So yeah, so and as it happens, that's a kind of a strange segue into my into a question, because I'm curious about how this is before getting into the issues, the sort of more specific psychiatric aspects of things. You identified the basic sense making as having metabolic values.
Yes.
And then there are other forms of sense making, introducing the social. Is there any level between basic and existential sense making? Is there a social or cultural aspect to things that we might consider sense making, but not necessarily existential?
Well, I think the existential sense making is thoroughly dependent on our social cultural. That it's thoroughly it goes together, so to say. That once you're part of a social cultural community, this is part of the. That's just part of being a cultural being. I think that you relate to others as well, and also that's the way we learn it. I think by much like Haan and Ezekiel describe that learning social interaction by interacting with others. I think it's similar with this existential stance that others will tell you. How would you feel if I would take your toy away or something? Or even very basic, if you play peekaboo, you already practice with when can the person see me and when can I see that person? So the whole idea of other people having a different perspective and other people may see you while you can't see them and so on. All this is just a huge practice that's very much a social cultural one. And of course, language plays a huge role too, but I haven't got into that at all. But of course, when you talk about social cultural communities, that's going to be a part of it. But yes, whether there are sort of different. That's what you asked, right? Whether there are sort of a different in between, sort of the basic and the existential. Yeah, so I tend to see it as a sort of a set of skills, so to say, and I can see that there are sort of in between ways, just like some, and I think this is very nicely illustrated when you look at children growing up, that you expect different things from a 8-year-old than from a 4-year-old, so to say, depending on what they can do. So an 8-year-old, you can just say, and now be silent when you are in a specific setting, say a funeral or something. But a baby, that's just not something you can ask of a baby. That's just ridiculous to just think you should now be. That just doesn't make sense. But there's this whole in between sort of this whole learning, this whole set of skills that you develop along the way. Is that an answer to your question, actually?
Yes, no, it does. So I'm just looking at.
Oh yes. Oh wait. How can I see these comments actually?
I
can see them. Yeah.
The chat window. So I don't know whether Mark or Leonardo, if they're having issues either unmuting or having technical issues with the microphone, or been having a few technical issues this morning. So, but so Mark, can you see Mark's comment there? So I'll just read that for those who may not be able to, who can't see the text here. So Mark indicates it seems that scales between basic and existential include memory and language, and so perhaps there are different levels which connects these abilities in areas.
Yes. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense indeed. Memory, language, very much so. So yeah, so I think that's basically, I agree with that. And why I do want to sort of make this qualitative shift point is that I do think that at a certain point, you, so to say, cannot go back to the basic sense making anymore, in the sense that once you have become this reflective person, you cannot scream and cry at a funeral as if you were a baby. There's a sort of responsibility involved, or there's a sort of you now know something that you cannot unknow. You can, or if you say, "Oh, but I hadn't thought of your perspective on things," then you can actually blame the person for that and say, "Well, but you should have thought about the other person's perspective. You can't just pretend as if you're on your own." So yeah, but I agree with that.
Yeah, so and that actually that strikes me as that gets at one of the other sort of points I'm curious about, which has to do with the relationship. When you talked about the metabolic values in basic sense making and the interaction between the organism and its environment, and then we have the person in the world and social or cultural values. I began to wonder whether there is some kind of resonance or similarity in dynamic between those different kinds of values. Is there a sense in which the cultural values are still metabolic, except that we're talking about, our culture is metabolizing us in this case, or
Yes.
an interesting sense in which when the values are outside of us as individuals, our behavior gets drawn into and metabolized by that, broader dynamic.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good point. So yes, on the one hand, I would want to say that the existential changes or can override, I would say, our metabolic values, in the sense, like I said, we can refrain from eating because it would be impolite to eat before the host would start eating, even if we're very hungry, for instance. So these kinds of ways in which we deal with, or sex is also a very good example. I mean, we just don't go around groping people by the pussy normally, decent people, and so you can't sort of it sort of overrides or it molds or it shapes. But the other way around, like you point out, is still very much true, I think, because I think that being vulnerable and how do you say, beings that die eventually is so important for how the kind of values we have in life. So our shared vulnerability is, I think, very much shaping the kind of things that we value and the kind of things that we also socially think are acceptable and not. And this, of course, all depends on the fragility of our bodies and also our specific needs. I mean, it would be an interesting thought experiment if there would be possible a life form that doesn't need to eat. What kind of values would they have, so to say? Yeah, this was just, but I do think we remain bodily beings throughout, also just as much as existential beings, as we're existential beings.
Excellent, thanks. So I'll we seem to be having some technical difficulties with muting and unmuting, unfortunately. So I'll continue to give voice to the others. So Leonardo asks, how would we empirically operationalize the conception of sense making we're talking about there? So
yes,
are there experiments we can do? Are there observations we can make?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, yeah, it's. I mean, yeah, it must. There must be. And there are many experiments, of course, for instance, within the social cognition, a history of perspective taking, and the whole Sally Ann kind of experiment. Does Sally understand now where Anne has hidden the chocolates or not? And so because there's so many dimensions of it, dimensions of sense of perspective taking that range from this very basic, can you see me if I can't see you, that kind of thing, is very spatial, but also in terms of, can you reflect on what another person might, how we interpret movies, how we interpret the motivations of others, and so on. And I think this whole range of capacities is basically tied to this existential sense making. Whereas if you put a bacteria in a certain environment where there's glucose or sucrose somewhere, it will find that, or it will go there. And that's a form of sense making too. But yeah, I'm suspecting you're hoping for a more clear-cut operationalization. So yeah, it's not as if there's one thing that comes to mind, sort of like a definitive thing.
It does. It strikes me as one of the ongoing issues for enactive thinking in general, actually, that it hasn't sort of managed to capture that. Although partly I wonder whether there's a certain historical inertia about what we consider adequate operationalization for psychology. So one of the things you noted right at the beginning of your talk was that we have the sort of this blossoming in the last decade or so, or even more recently than that, of network theories of psychological disorder. And in essence, but as you said, it's kind of it's more of a method rather than a theory.
Yes.
Wondering, is partly actually what you're suggesting is that there's a enactive theory is a way of sort of encapsulating what the network methods are getting at.
Yes, well, yeah, thanks for that point. That's so I think actually network theory needs enactivism to be integrative. That's what I would basically say. So it's a method, but it doesn't have a theory. And no model will tell you how to apply it. So there's nothing in network models that will say this will be part of the network and this won't, or this is the relation, this is how we should understand the relation between the nodes, or this is a pathological network and this is a non-pathological. We need a theory, and I think enactivism and these network models, I think they go together very well. I mean, in general, of course, the whole dynamical system view is inherent in the enactivist thinking. So I think this whole network approach is a huge, how do you say, leap forward compared to many of the reductionist models that have been around for so long. It's a really different way of thinking, of things influencing each other, and so it's a different model, but still you need to have a theory. So yes, I think we could sort of use network model-like methods, but they need us just as well if you want to do anything senseful, basically.
Yeah. It certainly seems that there's an opportunity for some kind of collaboration and conversation there, anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and to give voice then to Leonardo made a second point, which has to do with, I think, specific behavioral or psychological dysfunction on the basis of local brain disorder. So, I guess we can go with the super classic example of Broca's area. Broca's aphasia, or maybe occipital lobe damage and scotomas and so on. How do we sort of cope with those kinds of effects if we're dealing with this complex network model?
Yes, well, I think this picture of this network that I showed, you do see that some of these nodes are really strongly connected to other parts. I mean, if you would take out one of these nodes or somehow destroy it or something, or strengthen it, you could see that it would have a bigger effect than other nodes, so to say, of the system. Yeah, so there are many things to say. I noticed that Mark also commented on this, saying that it would be like leaving yeast out of the bread or something. So and his point also being that it's easy to overlook the contribution of all the other ingredients. I very much agree with that, because even if we, for instance, if we make a lesion in a specific brain area, the whole functioning of that specific brain area has been dependent on our developmental process, so on our previous interactions with the world, to have been developed in this way in the first place. And also, So I think this basically comes to the fore so I've been involved in deep brain stimulation, or not me being involved in, but talking to patients who have had received deep brain stimulation for obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is, I think, a really good example of that. In first instance, you think this must be fitting with a reductionist approach. So we do something in the brain and something a lot changes. But then, of course, you need to see the brain itself in the context of how it has been developed and how it depends on the body as a whole, but also the procedure actually. But this is actually going a bit in the other way around. But the whole, what they call placebo effects, are also pretty large in deep brain stimulation. So the fact that you talk to people every week and you are seen by a professor and you're going to this specialized center and you receive CBT. Anyway, yeah, so there are, it doesn't, I don't want to say that the brain is not important, and also not that, of course, if you make certain lesions or you have certain interventions, then you have huge effects which suggest very specialized contribution, but still, like Mark pointed out here, it's easy to overlook the importance of all the other things being around for this to function in the first place.
So I guess, and there's what I think would probably be a nice final question here from Mark, which has to do with what are the implications of your way of thinking for treatment and intervention and so on.
That's thanks very much for asking that question, Mark, because I found it difficult to cut out this part of the talk. Maybe can I even show some slides again?
Absolutely, yeah.
If I go back here. Oh wait, but now you can't. Can you see what I'm seeing now?
No, you'll need to screen share again.
Oh yes, screen share. Yes, yeah. Oh yeah, just like before. Okay, perfect. Right. Yes. Hide this one. Then go back here. Yes.
Brilliant.
Right. There we have it. I think the effect of taking this enactive approach for thinking about treatment is basically twofold. So on the one hand, we have this question where to intervene, but also how to understand when we intervene, what's happening when we intervene. And here is again this idea of this being a complex network where things work on each other, but still, like I just said, or like I said with the difference between psychotherapy and drug taking, it does matter whether you interact in the big blue blob or one of the smaller oranges one, that will have different effects and different causal trajectories. And I think some very interesting things follow from thinking in this complex dynamical systems kind of way. First of all, a very optimistic one in the sense that there are many ways to intervene, and another optimistic one that it being non-linear, well, this can actually go both ways, but because it could also make things worse, but it could also have positive effects that if you add two kinds of treatments, the effects of it might be more than just the added effect of one and one. And an important thing is it doesn't allow for reverse engineering. So from the fact that certain antidepressants drugs, for instance, work, we cannot conclude that it was thus a neurotransmitter problem, because the effects are so dependent on the context as a whole. Right, and the factors that keep a person in a certain, in say a depressed state, might not be the same as the ones that put it in motion, so to say. So we're very focused in psychiatric research on finding the cause or the neural mechanisms of something, whereas actually what started something off might not be the same as what keeps something in there. So someone in that situation, losing my job may trigger a depression, but if I then get my job back, it doesn't mean that I get out of the depression, because the state has switched the system has switched to a different state, so to say. Yes, and it's unlikely that one treatment fits all, with all these different causal trajectories leading up to various problems. Which calls, I think, for what I would say personalized network models. Right. Now, the final point being that I think an enactive approach also encourages to be very, how do you say, liberal or open-minded about different types of interventions, including body-oriented and environment-oriented interventions. But, and this is the sort of the sad point to end with, I've been thinking a lot about whether we could sort of how should I say it? Whether we could devise a navigational rule from this enactive point, like we should always start with from global to local or something like that. But I think actually there isn't such a way. It has to be. It will still depend on this individual's strengths and weaknesses. So yeah, no, I haven't been. I don't think there is sort of like a rule of thumb, like we always start by this or doing that. I just don't think that really follows from this such a complex system. Yeah, I hope this is somewhat helpful.
Yeah.
Oh wait, now I need to quit sharing my screen somehow. Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. So yes, I think we're sort of running out of time. So I will say thank you very much once again to Sanneke. It's a really interesting set of concepts and ideas there. So I'm very grateful for you for taking some time to talk to us this morning and answer questions, even if we did have to deliver them secondhand.
Yes, yeah. And thank you, Mark, and also thanks, Mark and Leonardo, for joining us. And
Yes.
And let's be in touch.
Yeah, and thanks very much as well. And my apologies, Mark, Leonardo. I'm not quite sure what the technical issues were this morning, but we'll hopefully have that sorted for future presentations as well. But it was great to be able to at least still give voice to them nonetheless. On that note, I will bid you all good morning, good afternoon, and/or good evening, depending on geography and time. And we will see you at the next ENSO seminar.